So Justin, how often do you see patients that could enroll on a trial? So maybe, someone has a HER2 mutation, KRAS G12C mutation, and they come in for a second opinion. They've already started on some kind of treatment, but that was on the panel. There just isn't a standard of care option, but there was a clinical trials option. Is that something that I imagine that must come up from time to time?
It does. So I think you raise the point, which is, okay, so if we're looking outside of the 7 targets for which we have approved therapies, and I'll pick up on the 2 that you just described, HER2. Actually, let's focus on HER2 because I think that's a good example. So HER2 mutations, prior to this, so what goes into my decision making is, so just because there's a mutation there, is it a driver? So for HER2, I would say, depending on what the mutation is, but say let's pick the most common one, the YVMA. Yes, that's a driver, and we know that's important. But then, in terms of clinical trials, how promising is the clinical trial relative to what a standard of care option is? So, if historically many of the HER2 drugs, trying to use just targeted therapies has produced pretty low response rates, and in that era, I would still even knowing it, I would still favor chemotherapy as a first-line treatment over some of those early targeted therapies, because the response rates we saw with some of those targeted therapies was less than 10%. More recently, though, we've seen with antibodies targeting HER2, and we call them antibody drug conjugates. We're now seeing response rates 60%. So for that, then once you've established some data, then you start having balancing that against the standard options, and you can say, okay, here it makes a lot more sense. But it takes some understanding of what the data is already in order to match that against what the standard of care options are.
I think just a final word to follow up actually on the point Dr. Guinea was making is that just because there's an alteration doesn't mean that being on one of these treatments or clinical trials, or being on one of these clinical trials is the right initial treatment. But it is worth just getting the information. And so getting broad panel testing is very important to knowing your options, and then you can make decisions based on that. And it's not always the first treatment, but it's good to be aware of what is out there. So making sure that you've gotten the broad testing and seeing a lung cancer specialist can also be really valuable to just knowing what options and what the landscape looks like going forward.